The stench hit them first, a wave of putrefaction so vile it made grown men gag and recoil. The priests, sweltering in their heavy robes inside the packed French abbey, tried to ignore it. They were burying a king, after all. But as the pallbearers struggled to shove the bloated corpse into its stone sarcophagus, a horrifying reality dawned. He was too big. The body, swollen with the gases of decay, wouldn't fit. They pushed harder, and that's when the King of England exploded. His abdomen ruptured, spewing a torrent of corrupted viscera across the sacred floor, drenching the horrified nobility in the filth of their dead monarch. This wasn't just any king. This was William, the man they called the Conqueror, and his grotesque end was a fitting postscript to a life forged in blood, terror, and the absolute refusal to be denied.
To understand the monster, you have to understand the boy. And the boy began with a single word, a word that would follow him like a shadow for his entire life: bastard. He was the illegitimate son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and a tanner's daughter named Herleva. In the rigid hierarchy of the 11th century, this was more than a scandal. It was a permanent stain. He had the blood of a ruler, but the social standing of a commoner's get. While his father, Robert, acknowledged him and even adored him, the Norman barons, a viper's nest of ambitious and ruthless men, saw only an opportunity. They saw a weakness, a boy who by law and custom had no real right to rule. They smiled to his face while sharpening their daggers in the shadows, waiting. They knew that the life of the Duke, a man known for his piety and his recklessness, was the only thing keeping this boy alive. And that life was about to be cut short.
In 1035, Duke Robert decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before he left, he made his squabbling barons swear an oath of fealty to his 7-year-old son, William. They swore it, their fingers crossed behind their backs. Robert never returned. He died on the journey home. And with his death, Normandy didn't just descend into chaos, it exploded. The boy Duke was a prize to be captured, a pawn to be eliminated. His guardians were murdered one by one. One had his throat slit while he slept. Another, his tutor, was ambushed and killed in the boy's own bedroom. William spent his childhood not in a classroom, but in a constant state of flight, being shuttled from one safe house to another, learning to sleep with one eye open. He learned a vital lesson in those bloody years. Power isn't given, it is taken, and to hold it, you must be more ruthless, more cunning, and more brutal than anyone who comes for you. The boy was being forged into a weapon.
By the time he was a teenager, William was done running. He was ready to fight back. In 1047, a coalition of his most powerful barons, led by his own cousin, decided the time was right to finally crush the bastard. They trapped him, thinking his small force was no match for their numbers. They were wrong. William, with the crucial help of his overlord, King Henry I of France, met them at a place called Valdunes. This was his first real test, his first command in a major battle, and he proved to be a natural. He wasn't some distant general, he was in the heart of the fighting, a terrifying figure on his warhorse, cutting down his enemies. He shattered the rebellion, he hunted the fleeing lords, forcing them to submit. The message was clear. The boy was gone. In his place stood a duke, one who had earned his title not by birthright, but by the cold, hard logic of steel. With Normandy finally beaten into submission, William could lift his gaze, and he looked north, across the narrow strip of water to the richest prize in Europe, England. The English throne was a ticking bomb. The king, Edward the Confessor, was childless and aging. His death would create a power vacuum, and 3 men believed they had the right to fill it. First, there was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, a charismatic and proven military leader, the choice of the English people. Then, from the frozen north, came Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, a legendary Viking warrior who believed he had a claim through a tangled web of old treaties. And then there was William. His claim was the shakiest of all, based on a supposed promise from Edward, who was his distant cousin. In a game this big, with a prize this valuable, promises meant nothing. Only armies mattered. William knew this, and he began to prepare.
Then, fate handed William an unbelievable gift. In 1064, Harold Godwinson, his main rival, was shipwrecked on the coast of Normandy and taken prisoner. William had him. Instead of a dungeon, William treated him with respect as a guest, but it was a gilded cage. Before he would let Harold return to England, William demanded something, an oath. He made Harold swear to support his claim to the English throne upon Edward's death. To seal the deal, he had Harold place his hands upon a covered table and swear. Harold, with little choice, did so. Only then did William reveal what was beneath the cloth. Not one, but two massive caskets filled with the holiest relics he could find. In that deeply religious age, swearing a false oath on the bones of a single saint was a mortal sin that damned your soul for eternity. Harold had just sworn one on dozens. He was trapped. William had not only secured a promise, he had a powerful piece of propaganda he could use to brand Harold an oathbreaker and a perjurer in the eyes of God and all of Christendom.
On January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. On his deathbed, he supposedly named Harold Godwinson his successor. The very next day, before William could even receive the news, Harold was crowned King of England. It was a brilliant political move, a lightning-fast seizure of power. But for William, it was the ultimate betrayal. The promise, the oath on holy relics, it all meant nothing. Harold had played him for a fool. The accounts say that when William heard the news, he fell into a silent, terrifying rage, pacing his halls, speaking to no one. This was more than a political setback, it was a personal insult. It was the world once again trying to deny him what he believed was his. The bastard of Falaise was now the spurned claimant of England, and he would answer this insult not with words, but with an invasion that would tear the world apart.
What William planned next was the single largest amphibious invasion in European history since the Roman Empire. It was a monumental undertaking. He ordered the construction of a fleet of hundreds of ships from scratch. He put out a call to arms, and knights, mercenaries, and adventurers from all over France flocked to his banner, drawn by the promise of English land and wealth. He had to feed, arm, and house an army of over 10,000 men and transport thousands of horses, the medieval equivalent of battle tanks, across the treacherous English Channel. It was an organizational masterpiece. But his greatest move was diplomatic. He sent envoys to the Pope presenting his case. He spoke of his claim, of Edward's promise, and most importantly, of Harold's broken oath on the holy relics. The Pope, seeing a chance to extend his influence over the independent English Church, sided with William. He declared the invasion a holy crusade and sent William a papal banner to fly at the head of his army. Now, this wasn't just a war of conquest, it was a holy war.
All through the summer of 1066, William's invasion fleet was ready, but he was a prisoner of the weather. The winds blew relentlessly from the north, making a channel crossing impossible. On the other side, King Harold and his English army waited and waited. For months they stood guard on the southern coast, their supplies dwindling, their morale sinking. By early September, with the harvest needing to be brought in, Harold had no choice but to disband his army. It was the worst possible moment, because just as his army scattered, the second invasion struck. In the north, Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, landed with a massive force, ready to claim England for himself. He sacked York and defeated the local English forces. Harold Godwinson had just sent his army home, and now the most feared warrior in the Viking world was on his doorstep. The chessboard had been violently overturned.
What Harold did next is one of the most remarkable feats in English military history. Upon hearing of the Viking invasion, he reassembled his core army of elite housecarls and began a forced march north. Not just a march, a sprint. His army covered nearly 200 miles in 4 days, an absolutely punishing pace. They were marching to save their country, to repel an invader they thought was the greatest threat. They arrived at York so quickly that they caught the Vikings completely by surprise. Hardrada had won his initial battle and was so confident that he didn't even have his full army wear their armor. He had no idea that the English king was anywhere near him. Harold had set the perfect trap.
The battle took place at a river crossing called Stamford Bridge. The Vikings were caught completely unprepared. The English army smashed into them. The fighting was savage, a brutal contest between two of the world's fiercest warrior cultures. According to legend, a single, gigantic Viking berserker held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, cutting down dozens of men, before he was finally killed by a soldier who was floated under the bridge in a barrel to spare him from below. But even his legendary stand couldn't stop Harold's furious assault. The English won a stunning, decisive victory. Harald Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, was killed. His army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that brought the Vikings to England, only 24 were needed to take the survivors home. Harold Godwinson had saved England. But as he stood on the bloody battlefield, a messenger arrived, breathless, with the worst possible news. The wind had changed. William had landed in the south.
There was no time to rest, no time to celebrate. Harold had just fought one of the bloodiest battles of his life, and now he had to turn his exhausted army around and march another 250 miles south to face a fresh, rested, and fully equipped Norman force. It's almost unimaginable. He was asking his men, who were already wounded and weary, to perform a second miracle. Meanwhile, William had landed at Pevensey Bay completely unopposed. He wasn't just waiting, he was actively trying to force Harold's hand. He unleashed his army on the surrounding countryside, burning, looting, and killing. This was Harold's own personal earldom. William was burning his homes, terrorizing his people. It was a calculated, brutal provocation, designed to enrage Harold and draw him into a battle before he was truly ready.
And it worked. Against the advice of his own brother, who urged him to wait for reinforcements and starve William out, Harold's pride forced his hand. He raced south and took up a defensive position on a ridge called Senlac Hill near the small town of Hastings. It was a powerful position. His army, composed almost entirely of infantry, formed a shield wall, an interlocking line of shields bristling with spears. It was a human fortress, virtually unbreakable by cavalry. From the top of the hill, they looked down on William's army. The Normans had the advantage in technology, heavily armored knights on war horses and a large contingent of archers, but they had to attack uphill against a fortified, unmoving wall of English steel. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles in history. The battle began around 9 in the morning. William opened with his archers, sending clouds of arrows arcing towards the English line. But because they were firing uphill, the arrows either fell short or flew harmlessly over the heads of the Saxons. It was ineffective. Next came the main event, the charge of the Norman knights.
Thousands of armored men on horseback thundered up the slope, a terrifying spectacle. They crashed into the shield wall with the force of a tidal wave. But the wall held. The English housecarls, wielding massive two-handed battle axes, hacked at the horses and men. The charge faltered, broke, and then fled back down the hill. On one flank, the Breton cavalry broke completely and ran. The English, sensing victory, roared in triumph. William's strategy had failed.
Panic began to ripple through the Norman army. A rumor spread like wildfire. William was dead. The battle was lost. In this moment of crisis, William proved his greatness as a commander. He rode through the ranks, tearing his helmet from his head so all could see his face, and roared that he was alive and would win the day. Then he either noticed something or made a brilliant decision. He had seen the English break formation to chase the fleeing Bretons earlier. Now he would turn it into a weapon. He ordered his knights to charge the shield wall, and then, after a brief fight, to turn and pretend to flee. It was an incredibly dangerous and difficult maneuver to pull off, but it was his only chance. He was baiting a trap.
And the English fell for it. Some of the less disciplined troops on the English side, believing the Normans were truly broken, couldn't resist. They broke from the safety of the shield wall and charged down the hill, hungry for the kill. It was a fatal mistake. Once they reached the flat ground, the trap was sprung. The fleeing Norman knights wheeled their horses around and charged back into the disorganized mob. They were cut off, surrounded, and slaughtered. William repeated this tactic again and again throughout the long afternoon. Each time, a few more foolish Englishmen would break ranks. Each time, they were annihilated. The great shield wall, the impenetrable fortress, was being slowly and deliberately dismantled, piece by piece.
The battle had raged for over 8 hours, an incredibly long time for a medieval engagement. The sun was beginning to set. The English were exhausted, their numbers depleted, but they were still holding the high ground. William knew he had to break them before nightfall, when they could slip away. He ordered one final combined assault, but this time he told his archers to do something different. He told them to aim high, to let their arrows plunge down on the English from above like a deadly rain. And it was one of these arrows that changed history. The Bayeux Tapestry, our primary visual source for the battle, shows a figure with an arrow in his eye, under the inscription, "Here King Harold was killed." Whether by this arrow or cut down by Norman knights in the final melee, the result was the same. The king was dead.
With Harold's death, the English resistance shattered. The shield wall broke, and the battle turned into a massacre. The Normans pursued the fleeing English into the twilight, cutting them down without mercy. Anglo-Saxon England died on that hill. William marched towards London, but the city refused to submit, so he did what he did best. He applied terror. He burned the surrounding areas to the ground until the terrified city fathers finally surrendered. On Christmas Day 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the church built by the king he had just defeated, William was crowned King of England. But even his coronation was bathed in violence. When the English in the congregation shouted their traditional acclamation of the new king, the nervous Norman guards outside mistook it for an uprising and set the nearby houses on fire. The ceremony had to be completed in a smoke-filled abbey as the city burned around them. It was a fitting start to his reign.
Winning the crown was one thing, holding it was another. The English were a proud and rebellious people, and for the next few years, William faced constant uprisings. The most serious came from the north. In 1069, the northern earls rose up and annihilated the Norman garrison at Durham. William's response was not just a military campaign, it was a calculated act of genocide. It's known to history as the harrying of the North.
For an entire winter, he marched his army across the northern counties, from York to Durham, and systematically destroyed everything. They burned villages, crops, and food stores. They slaughtered livestock. They murdered men, women, and children. He salted the earth to ensure nothing would grow for a generation. The chroniclers speak of over 100,000 people dying of starvation. It was an act of such profound, inhuman cruelty that even the medieval chroniclers, no strangers to brutality, were shocked. This is where the conqueror truly becomes the monster. With the North pacified by terror, William set about remaking England in his own image. He initiated a massive castle-building program, erecting stone fortresses across the country to dominate the landscape and the population. He systematically dispossessed the entire Anglo-Saxon ruling class, replacing them with his own loyal Norman, French, and Breton lords. Within 20 years of the conquest, over 90% of the land in England was in the hands of the conquerors. To solidify his control and maximize his tax revenue, he commissioned an unprecedented survey of his new kingdom, the Domesday Book. It was a detailed inventory of every piece of property, every person, every farm animal in England. It was a breathtaking act of administration and control. He was no longer just a conqueror, he was the absolute owner of England and everyone in it. The final years of his reign were spent fighting wars in France, often against his own rebellious son. He had grown enormously fat, a shadow of the athletic warrior who had conquered a kingdom. In 1087, during a campaign in France, his horse stumbled, throwing the heavy king against the pommel of his saddle. The internal injury was severe. He lingered in agony for weeks before finally dying. But even in death, he found no peace. His attendants, fearing the wrath of his successor, stripped his body and abandoned it. It was left to a lowly knight to arrange for the funeral. And it was at that funeral, in an abbey he himself had founded, that his body, too bloated with the corruption of his life to fit into its final resting place, burst apart. The man who had seized a kingdom with such brutal efficiency couldn't even manage a dignified exit from the world. So who was William the Conqueror? A monster? A genocidal tyrant who seized a kingdom through violence and ruled it with terror? Absolutely. The Anglo-Saxon world was extinguished by his ambition. Tens of thousands died, an entire culture was suppressed. But was he also the maker of modern England? Yes. The conquest irrevocably tied England to mainland Europe, ending its Scandinavian drift. He created one of the most powerful and centralized monarchies in the world. The English language you are hearing right now is a hybrid of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French. The legal system, the political structure, the very concept of the state all bear his indelible, bloody fingerprints. He destroyed a nation, but in doing so, he laid the foundations for a new one. The England we know today was born in the catastrophe of 1066. History is rarely a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of consequences. William's life is a testament to the brutal, world-shattering power of a single individual's will. A man who began with nothing but a tainted name and ended by forging a kingdom in fire. But the question remains, was the price worth it? Was the creation of England worth the destruction of England? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of the dark and brutal side of history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.